My husband, Luke, isn't exactly the type to take the lead when it comes to our relationship. Sure, he knows how to pull off the occasional grand gesture right on time, but he's not the guy who's going to surprise me with a weekend getaway just for the fun of it, anniversary or not. So, I was honestly taken aback when Luke told me he'd booked us a stay at the Claremont Club and Spa Hotel. What really floored me was that he even remembered I wanted to stay there. I'd only mentioned it in passing one day, a throwaway comment in one of those aimless conversations where we just kind of make noises at each other, barely even listening. But somehow, he'd held on to it. We'd attempted to celebrate our anniversary 5 times already, and failed every single year. Our first anniversary. That hit during the early COVID days. The next year, our son was born. The year after that, he caught croup just before the big day. The following year, I had just given birth again, this time to twins, and last year, we were honestly too worn out to even think about celebrating. Let's just say, having a proper anniversary celebration has been an uphill battle. But this year, it seemed like it might actually happen. I went all out on backup plans, maybe even overboard, because I lined up 2 extra sitters just in case my parents got overwhelmed handling our 3 little ones under 3. As we drove up into the Berkeley Hills, Luke reached over to give my hand a reassuring squeeze. He could tell I was holding my phone like I was expecting that dreaded call, the one that would mean we had to turn around because something had gone wrong. That's what 5 years of failed attempts does to you. I'd lost any hope of it going smoothly. I even started thinking that not being able to celebrate our anniversary was some sort of bad omen for us. It wasn't Luke's first joke that nearly ruined my mood, it was the one that came after. As we were pulling up to the hotel, he cracked a joke about it looking like the Karen of buildings. I didn't get it at first, but then he pointed out the hotel's stark white exterior, perched on a hill in a fancy neighborhood, overlooking Oakland, with a barbed wire fence marking its territory. I told him I'd been fighting for 5 long years just to get us here together, and I wasn't interested in hearing stupid jokes, I wanted romance and relaxation. He told me I was sounding like a Karen myself. The worst part? He was right, and somehow, that only made it more annoying. Walking into the lobby, it still didn't feel real. I kept expecting that any minute we'd get called away. But with each step toward our room, I started to relax a little more. Which, by the way, involved quite a few steps because he booked us the Tower Suite, a suite sitting alone at the end of a long, repetitive hallway that felt like it would never end. By the time we climbed our private staircase and took in the panoramic view from the top-floor tower, framed by grand columns, I had finally let my guard down. We were really here. We were actually celebrating our anniversary. We packed light, but the emotional baggage we brought with us was anything but. Lately, it seemed like we'd been clashing over a million little things, but the real issue was that he felt so distant, which never bodes well. People warn you about the hard days in marriage, but what they don't tell you is that some days aren't just hard, they're downright brutal. Between life's demands and the chaos of parenting, we'd been taking a beating for a while. And to be honest, even before all that, we'd had a bumpy ride, being high school sweethearts who finally tied the knot in our 30s. It wasn't always a fairy tale. At times, it felt like we were so busy putting out fires that we didn't have anything left for each other. My days were a blur of feedings, diaper changes, naps, and meltdowns from 3 little ones, all while trying to keep our home running and make sure dinner was on the table. Meanwhile, Luke was stuck in bumper-to-bumper traffic on his way to a dull job, only to come home and jump right into the bedtime routine. By the time we sat down together each night, I'd zone out to reality TV, while he scrolled through his phone for what felt like 5 minutes before we both drag ourselves to bed, only to start the whole cycle again the next day. Honestly, my patience was worn thinner than ever. I'd never felt this exhausted, this hormonal, this disconnected, or, to be blunt, this sexually neglected. Since our first child was born 3 years ago, intimacy between us had turned into a twice-a-year event. So, I was holding on to a little hope that, just maybe, this weekend would turn that into a twice-a-night kind of thing. We kicked off our stay with some laid-back time by the pool, even though neither of us are big swimmers. I soaked up the sun, while Luke was absorbed in a college football game on the nearby TV, his phone buzzing every so often with score updates. For the first time in years, I was lost in a book, surfacing from its pages now and then to glance around. Each time, it seemed like the crowd around us had swapped out for a new set of people, everyone except for one woman. Just past Luke's shoulder, a woman lingered. She wasn't doing anything to draw attention, in fact, she seemed to be minding her own business. But each time I looked over, there she was, slightly out of focus, almost blending into the background. Her face was partially hidden by her hair and sunglasses, and even if she hadn't been, my eyesight probably wouldn't have made out much detail anyway. What I did notice was her constant smile, almost unnervingly cheerful. It was strange. Who is that happy all the time? Sure, she had every right to be there, enjoying herself, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something off about her. It was like she was too happy, like she was there for some odd, foreboding reason. Later, as the sun set over the bay, we watched from our tower suite. The sky looked like it was painted in cotton candy pinks and blues, reflecting over the water, but somehow, my mind wandered. I found myself looking back down to where we'd just been sitting, searching for the woman. I couldn't actually see her because of the trees, and I had no idea if she was even still there, but I somehow felt her presence lingering. Luke gently put his hand on my lower back, bringing me back into the moment with him. Our dinner reservation was set for later in the evening, and thankfully, the restaurant was right there in the hotel, a real high-end spot with this cozy, mid-century modern vibe under dim, moody lighting. Yelp had promised excellent food, but raved about the atmosphere even more, and I couldn't agree more. It was worlds away from our day-to-day life. I don't know how Luke felt, but for that hour or so, I felt like a version of myself I hadn't seen in a long time. I wasn't weighed down by endless responsibilities, wasn't dreading tomorrow's to-do list, wasn't settling for canned spaghetti dinners. It felt amazing, and maybe a little wrong to enjoy it so much. It didn't take long for Luke and me to reconnect, to remember that, underneath all the stress, we still had that spark. It was easy to fall back into a rhythm together. Maybe it was just from being pent up for so long, but he was more playful and flirty than I'd seen him in ages. It felt like he was showing me this new, surprising side of himself, so different it almost threw me off. But, honestly, it had me feeling excited in a way I hadn't felt in years. As we waited for our entrees, I started people watching, a favorite pastime of mine. I like imagining what strangers are like and what brought them to wherever they are. Sometimes, after a night out, I'll look up the location on Instagram to see if I can find any of them and check if my guesses were on point. It's a nosy habit, I know, but in my defense, Luke can get a little too absorbed in his phone. It's frustrating, honestly. I mean, it's downright infuriating when he cracks a grin at a buddy's text while I'm left just sitting there, out of the loop and, apparently, smirk-proof. At this point, our food still hadn't arrived, and I'd mentally assigned a name, backstory, and personality to every person at each table. Then, I realized a fresh group of faces had settled in. Behind Luke, on the wall, there was a mirror that just happened to catch the reflection of the bar. I started playing a little game, judging each barstool occupant as I panned along, tech guy, total jerk. Then I got to the last person, and there she was, smiling straight at me. My gut reaction was to drop my gaze, feeling caught, and I tried to convince myself she was probably looking at something else. I took a breath, mustered up a little courage, and slowly looked back up. She's still staring, dead set on me, and the look on her face is almost unnerving. My initial embarrassment fades pretty fast when I realize I recognize her. It's the same woman from the pool. With the lighting so dim, I can't make out her face exactly, but I know it's her. That unsettling, fixed smile of hers made it feel like she was there with some kind of purpose. And although smiling is usually a friendly thing, hers felt more like it was painted on, like it didn't mean anything. Just then, Luke gets up from the table, saying he's headed to the restroom. I watch him until he disappears into the dim hallway, then glance back at the mirror. She's gone. And I don't know whether to be relieved or creeped out. On one hand, I was glad she wasn't staring anymore. But on the other, not knowing where she was or what she was up to made my skin crawl. Something about her just felt off. On our way back to the room, I remembered we were down to one towel. I told Luke I'd stop by the front desk to grab a few more and that he could go ahead. I wasn't ready to wind down for the night, anyway. The lobby fireplace was going, and I thought I'd settle in with a glass of wine and my book. Luke offered to wait, but I assured him I'd be fine on my own. So, I wandered around the lobby, found the comfiest chair, and settled in, alternating between reading, sipping, and eavesdropping on nearby conversations. After about an hour, I finished my glass and decided it was time to head back. Not far from me, a young woman without a ring was listening politely as an older man with a wedding band rambled on about how often he stayed at the hotel, boasting about his frequent visitor status. When she didn't react much, he switched to a story about how the hotel was haunted by a woman who supposedly wandered the grounds, and no one quite knew why. Naturally, my mind went straight to the woman I'd been seeing since we got there. He said she was harmless, maybe just someone who died there long ago and couldn't find her way out. Honestly, most people would get spooked by a story like that, but I'm not like most people. Did I want a ghost hanging around? Absolutely not. But there was no way I was letting a restless spirit ruin my first real night off in years. So, I shook off the thought, had the bartender top off my wine, then grabbed some extra towels and water bottles from the front desk before heading back up. I was nearing a T-shaped intersection in the hallway. The left turn led to our suite, the only room down that wing, while the right continued to other rooms. Suddenly, one of the bottles slipped off the stack of towels and hit the floor. As I bent down to grab it, trying not to spill my wine, I caught sight of something moving around the corner. I looked up and saw the trailing edge of long hair and sheer fabric floating around the corner, followed by a hand with delicate fingers grazing the wall. It was heading right for our room. Just as I stood up, I heard the sound of our door closing. I figured it must be housekeeping, maybe Luke had called them, forgetting I'd gone for more towels. When I walked into the room, there was Luke, freshly showered and standing there with just a towel. That wasn't exactly comfortable, given that a stranger had just been here. I shot him a look, and he raised an eyebrow, asking, "What?" I blurted, "Are you seriously standing here half-naked with some stranger in our room?" He looked genuinely confused and said, "What stranger?" For a second, I scanned his face, wondering if he was messing with me. Luke's sense of humor is so dry that it's not always clear when he's kidding. But then I realized he was serious. "The woman," I said. "I just saw her in the hallway and heard our door close. Didn't you call housekeeping or something?" He started getting dressed, saying calmly, "No, I didn't." A cold wave of unease washed over me as I realized someone might have been creeping around in our room. Luke and I searched every corner, but there was no sign anyone else had been there. Just to be sure, I called the front desk and asked if housekeeping had come by. After holding for what felt like ages, they confirmed no one had been sent up, even checking the cameras to tell me no one had entered the room before I did. That should have helped settle my nerves, but it didn't quite do the trick. After a long, warm shower, with my glass of wine in hand, don't judge, I finally got ready for bed. Luke was already under the covers, but he scooted over, making room as I climbed in beside him. As he wrapped himself around me, I felt a comfort I hadn't experienced in a long time. It was so cozy that I didn't want to move. In fact, I was just starting to shake off my worries and entertain a little romance when I heard it. I waited, just in case it was a fluke. But sure enough, he was out, snoring already. I tried to fall asleep, I really did. But the feeling that someone had been there, right in our room, kept creeping back, making it impossible to keep my eyes closed for long. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became, this wasn't housekeeping I'd seen. It was her. The woman. That ever-present feeling of her just clung to me, like I couldn't shake her image from my head, no matter how hard I tried. Now it's 3 in the morning, and I'm fully spiraling. Every snore coming from Luke beside me makes me feel a little more frustrated, a little more alone. How could he sleep so soundly while I lay here completely unsettled? It just didn't seem fair. Somehow, it never does. Suddenly, I noticed the dim glow from Luke's phone lighting up his side of the bed for a brief second, and that's when I saw it. At first, it blended into the dark shadows, but as my eyes adjusted, I could definitely make out a shape in the corner of the room. Her shape. She was here, staring right at me. And as soon as the screen went dark, her figure seemed to slip back into the shadows, disappearing without a trace. That was it for me. This was the last straw. I felt like I was coming apart, unable to even trust what I was feeling. Tears started streaming down my face, and I didn't think I had any left to cry. By now, Luke had woken up, and honestly, I almost wished he hadn't. I tried to tell him, tried to explain that the woman had been here, in our room. But instead of comforting me, he looked frustrated, as if he'd just been robbed of a rare, restful sleep. He said there was no woman, that we'd already checked everywhere, that it was all in my head. Then he had the nerve to ask how many glasses of wine I'd had since dinner, as if wine somehow made me imagine things like this. At that point, I felt like I couldn't count on him to back me up. He kept insisting the woman wasn't real, that it was all just in my mind. But I knew better. I knew she was real, and I knew she was here. A cold wave of unease washed over me as I realized someone might have been creeping around in our room. Luke and I searched every corner, but there was no sign anyone else had been there. Just to be sure, I called the front desk and asked if housekeeping had come by. After holding for what felt like ages, they confirmed no one had been sent up, even checking the cameras to tell me no one had entered the room before I did. That should have helped settle my nerves, but it didn't quite do the trick. After a long, warm shower, with my glass of wine in hand, don't judge, I finally got ready for bed. Luke was already under the covers, but he scooted over, making room as I climbed in beside him. As he wrapped himself around me, I felt a comfort I hadn't experienced in a long time. It was so cozy that I didn't want to move. In fact, I was just starting to shake off my worries and entertain a little romance when I heard it. I waited, just in case it was a fluke. But sure enough, he was out, snoring already. I tried to fall asleep, I really did. But the feeling that someone had been there, right in our room, kept creeping back, making it impossible to keep my eyes closed for long. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became, this wasn't housekeeping I'd seen. It was her. The woman. That ever-present feeling of her just clung to me, like I couldn't shake her image from my head, no matter how hard I tried. Now it's 3 in the morning, and I'm fully spiraling. Every snore coming from Luke beside me makes me feel a little more frustrated, a little more alone. How could he sleep so soundly while I lay here completely unsettled? It just didn't seem fair. Somehow, it never does. Suddenly, I noticed the dim glow from Luke's phone lighting up his side of the bed for a brief second, and that's when I saw it. At first, it blended into the dark shadows, but as my eyes adjusted, I could definitely make out a shape in the corner of the room. Her shape. She was here, staring right at me. And as soon as the screen went dark, her figure seemed to slip back into the shadows, disappearing without a trace. That was it for me. This was the last straw. I felt like I was coming apart, unable to even trust what I was feeling. Tears started streaming down my face, and I didn't think I had any left to cry. By now, Luke had woken up, and honestly, I almost wished he hadn't. I tried to tell him, tried to explain that the woman had been here, in our room. But instead of comforting me, he looked frustrated, as if he'd just been robbed of a rare, restful sleep. He said there was no woman, that we'd already checked everywhere, that it was all in my head. Then he had the nerve to ask how many glasses of wine I'd had since dinner, as if wine somehow made me imagine things like this. At that point, I felt like I couldn't count on him to back me up. He kept insisting the woman wasn't real, that it was all just in my mind. But I knew better. I knew she was real, and I knew she was here. I buried my face in my hands, feeling like I was falling apart completely. I think that's when Luke really snapped out of his sleepy haze and started to take it seriously. He looked totally unsure, like he didn't know whether to comfort me or freak out himself. He gently rubbed my back, saying he was sorry over and over, hoping it'd help me calm down. But that only made me feel more isolated, more afraid, more out of my mind. Luke kept throwing out reasons, trying to explain away what was happening. "You're just stressed," he'd say, or "you've been working too hard," or "you're exhausted." Each attempt felt like nails in a chalkboard, making me want to yell for him to stop. And I was just about to do it, I really was, when I looked up at him. She was there. Her arms were draped over his shoulders, her head tilted, and her eyes peeked out from behind his neck, almost like she was some shy creature hiding. I recoiled at the sight of her. At first, I could only see her eyes, but slowly, she shifted, coming out from behind him, her face twisted into that same unsettling smile, like she was mocking me. My breathing sped up, I felt trapped and panicked, and I bolted out of the room. I stumbled down the hallway, bouncing between the walls like I couldn't find my footing. Luke rushed after me, but the next thing I remember is waking up in a hospital bed. Luke said I wouldn't calm down and eventually passed out, so an ambulance was called to take me here. The doctors told me it had been an intense panic attack, brought on by too much stress. They explained how panic attacks are more common than people think, but since mine was so severe, I'd need follow-up care to help keep it from happening again. After a few weeks, I started feeling closer to my old self, learning a few grounding techniques that could keep me steady when anxiety crept in. Luke even joined a few of the sessions with me, and although it might sound sad, life just moved on. That's how it is, really, you can either keep up and move on, or let yourself get dragged down. I chose to heal and keep going. During my recovery, Luke stepped up and took on more of the day-to-day stuff to help ease my load. He was truly sorry for how isolated I'd felt through everything and made it a point to check in with me more often. He did everything he could to make things right. And it was a relief that our kids were young enough that we could shield them from all of it. They'd grow up never knowing about their mom's breakdown or the woman who haunted me at the Claremont. Every so often, my therapist still asks if I see her. I think I've gotten pretty good at lying because I always manage to say no with a believable smile. The truth is, I do still see her. She lingers in my peripheral vision now, just out of focus. Sometimes it's in the grocery store, at the far end of an aisle, or across a crowd during my son's t-ball games. Sometimes she's there in the reflection of Luke's eyes when he leans in close. But I've learned to ignore her, to refuse to let her scare me. Eventually, I hope, she'll just fade away. At least, that's what I keep telling myself.